I'm ashamed to say it, but it needs to be said. I screwed up on my job and a man died because of it. Not just a man I was being paid to protect. Usually I can be forgiven for making a mistake on my first job. However, when it's your first job protecting another man from outside dangers, one mistake can be the last. In retrospect, hindsight, whatever word you use, I wish I'd never agreed to taking the job. Just being a large-built man with a license to carry doesn't make you qualified to be a private security. This all being said, I took the job. The client losing his life is a direct result of my negligence. Maybe if I discuss what happened, I can relieve myself of a small amount of this burden. However, I can assure you I know the guilt will never truly fade away. The job came out of nowhere. Mike, a close friend of mine, had been a bodyguard on and off for years. He made it clear the job was a one-time only deal. No other guys he knew were available on such short notice. His next client was coming into town in the morning. Mike needed someone with a carry permit to back him up. He knew I had one, so I got the call. He assured me it wasn't a dangerous situation, but he liked to have another guy to watch his and the client's back. I was somewhat nervous initially, but the money I was offered was too good to pass up. We met up at his place later that night. He gave me a rough outline of what I was expected to do. Once it had been all laid out before me, it seemed simple enough. Although this would be his first time with this particular client, he assured me once more it would be simple. After all, the guys with the real problems always had their own staff. Our client was a regular suit and tie in town for some business. 4 hours of work and he'd be back on a plane home. The morning of the job, we met with the client at the airport. A third guy, Roger, was doing the driving for us that day. He's a retired SWAT officer who picked up the occasional driving job for Mike. He'd had a boatload of training in evasive maneuvers while he was in the Army. Plus, he could be a third gun in an emergency. He drove us to the client's first appointment and everything was going well. From what I could make out, the dude was a wholesale jeweler out of London. Stuff didn't really start falling apart until we were leaving the second place. As we exited the jeweler's store, I noticed a sketchy-looking, possibly Middle Eastern guy. He was standing in front of the place next door. When he noticed us leaving, he pulled a knife from his pocket and ran towards us. Before he could get anywhere near us, I instinctively moved toward him. He turned and ran, and I foolishly gave chase. I'd gotten somewhere around 30 yards and heard a barrage of gunshots behind me. I turned around just in time to see Mike go down. The client was already on the ground and wasn't moving. Roger was standing next to the car, shooting at 2 men running from the scene. By the time I'd drawn my pistol, the firefight had ended. It was clear to me I'd messed up. As Roger and I checked Mike and the client for signs of life, a weak few words came from Mike. "I hope you won't be offended if I don't ask for your help again." We had a brief chuckle, but we both knew this wasn't a laughing matter. Roger confirmed that the client was in fact dead. I rode to the hospital with Mike, and Roger stayed behind with the cops. This big mess made no sense. I knew I could trust Mike. He said the client indicated no current danger to his life. We were supposed to be only there to prevent robberies. We'd both seen the guy with a load of stones on him, so no flags went up. Regardless, considering the number of guys in on the hit, I had a strong feeling we didn't get the whole story. I'd been waiting for news on Mike for about half an hour when Roger finally showed. The cops were right behind him. Now it was my turn. When they were done with me, they wanted to talk to Mike, but he was still in surgery. 2 hours later, we got the good news. He was going to make it, but he'd be in the hospital for the next week at the least. For the next 9 days, I stayed at his side. It was the least I could do. The following morning, we had our first discussion since the shooting. "You do realize the guy with the blade was a decoy, right? Became pretty obvious once I heard you all yell at me to come back. Listen, don't feel guilty, it's not your fault. I've fallen for dumber things than that." We continued our talk for a while until Mike fell asleep. No matter what he said, though, I'd always feel bad. A man lost his life, after all. The detective showed up later that day and pumped him for any new info, but Mike had none. Mike was released 8 days later. Neither of us heard anything new until Roger called Mike 5 days later with some inside information he'd gotten from one of his pals. The client had been far from honest with us. He had hired us because he was involved in a deal with some men in which he screwed them out of $100,000. They had made it known if he was to return to the States, he'd be whacked. If Mike would have known this beforehand, he wouldn't have taken the job. That's likely why the dirtbag kept it quiet. Somehow this bit of info had made it past the background check. Nonetheless, even a crook doesn't deserve to be sprayed with bullets on a public street. We were only hearing it from their side. It could have all been a huge misunderstanding. After my anger cooled, it became obvious to me that I was just deflecting my feelings onto the client. Thief or not, I was responsible for the safety of the man. Not only had my mistake gotten him killed, a very good friend of mine almost did too. When Mike's back in fighting shape, I'm sure he'll return to security work, albeit in a slightly more careful manner. I'm just glad he's still kicking. I hope he gets someone in the future far more competent than myself. When it comes to me, I think I'll stick to construction. It appears to be a whole lot safer. I've refrained from speaking out about anything surrounding my case until now because of advice from my lawyer. However, now that my trial has reached its conclusion, I'm free to tell my side of the story. I can assure you from the start that I acted against the plaintiff because I felt my client's life was in danger. No matter what he claimed, Cannon's life had been littered with violent incidents. The judge not allowing his past to be brought up during the trial was ridiculous to me. He crippled another man, for God's sakes. I guess the concept of an eye for an eye applies to this story more than most. We seem to truly get what we deserve. Even as I write these words, let it be known I never intended to cripple him. Honestly, if he would have left my client alone, he'd still be walking the streets today. Since I'm well aware some of you reading this may not have the fondest idea of what I'm even writing about, I'll include a brief few paragraphs that explain exactly what occurred. When I received a call to my bodyguard for Mr. Butler, I was in between clients. Under normal circumstances, I would have declined the job, but I was way behind on my bills. People like him are magnets for conflict, and trying to protect them alone is a nightmare. He's already been sucker punched and milkshaked at this point. I repeatedly tried to convince him to shell out the cash for at least one more body, but he was too cheap. He most likely wouldn't have contacted me, but being attacked twice in a week seemed to have shook a few dollars loose from his wallet. Although I disagree with most of his views, I've always hated some folks attempting to silence those they don't see eye to eye with, not to mention the ones willing to kill to make things happen. So, with a boatload of reservations, I hopped on a plane to California. I'd written all of this and realized there may be some reading this that may not know who Ian Butler is. When it comes to my story, his identity doesn't really matter. To be brief, I'll say that he is a popular media personality with what some of the public eye would say is extreme beliefs. Because of these views, there are some members of our society willing to do anything they can to shut him up. A few are willing to go as far as ending him to achieve that goal, hence the reasoning behind his hiring of me, to act as a shield between the whack jobs and himself. One of those whack jobs was named Danny Alexander Cannon. The initial part of my job was to familiarize myself with Butler's enemies. Many of them had sent him multiple threatening emails and letters. Cannon was among this group, and something about his letters stood out to me as concerning. His threats weren't limited to letters. At many of Butler's public appearances, he would be in the crowd shouting threats at my client. Of course, the cops said that they were unable to do anything unless he threatened Butler physically. It It seemed the laws always protect the criminals at the cost of the victims, although he wasn't the only one of his detractors to act out this way. He would soon move to the front of the line in terms of those that posed a clear and present danger. I had spotted him several times myself, parked across the street from Butler's home. Usually when an individual makes the leap to surveilling of their enemies' homes and businesses, any threat they have made in the past should be taken as valid danger. Odds are they are compiling information on the target's daily movements in an effort to discover the best possible time for them to attack. This was just what Cannon had in mind. That day had been more chaotic than most. Butler had a morning meeting and a book signing later that day on the second level of the mall. This is where Cannon decided to make his move. I was standing behind the table while he signed, and the people attending were enthusiastic and cool. The usual picketers must have missed the announcement. We made it through the appearance and were on our way out of the mall when it all went down. A group of fans approached us outside the store. There were roughly 10 men and women surrounding us. Then, out of nowhere, Cannon burst through the crowd and tackled Butler. They fell to the ground and Cannon punched him in the gut, or so I thought at the time. When Cannon raised his hand to strike downward, I realized he was holding a knife with blood all over it. He had moved so fast it took me a moment to push my way through the crowd. I reached down and put a rear naked choke on him and lifted him up from Cannon's body. He began slashing at my arm and fighting me. At one point, I lost my balance and began falling back until I hit the handrail. I let go of Cannon at the last second and caught myself on the rail before I went over. Unfortunately for him, Cannon continued over onto the floor below. He'd fallen about 40 feet. It was enough to break his back and put him in a chair for the rest of his life. Butler's stab wound was painful, but it didn't kill him. A few days in the hospital and a few weeks to heal was enough for him. Cannon was convicted for attempted murder, amongst other things. He'd ended up with a sentence of 12 to 20 years. After the trial, I assumed it was all over, but you know what they say about assuming. A few months after his conviction, I was notified Cannon was suing me. This brings us back to the present. I'm happy to say I've been found not responsible for his injury, but I still find myself wishing that I just ended him. At the time of me writing this, I'm still working for Butler. I can happily announce that after the attack, he was finally convinced to hire a second guy to protect him. Although protecting the guy is still far from easy, having another set of eyes watching for threats has given me some semblance of peace. If not for the safety of my client, perhaps more for my own. Before I begin, I want to make it clear that I, at no time, will name any of the persons involved in the occurrences of this story. At present, the environment in Mexico is dangerous for all living there. However, those in the upper class, especially politicians, are constantly at risk of being kidnapped or worse. Writing about anyone or anything to do with the cartels can get you whacked. Therefore, when reading this story, it would be most beneficial to take it as a work of fiction, whether you may know from personal experience or not. So, with that out of the way, I'll begin. Fresh out of the army, I followed the path many of my brothers had before me into personal security. Some may call this gig bodyguarding, and for all appearances it is. To be direct, I served as a barrier between the crazies of the outside world and the guy paying me. On most days, the job borders on boring. At rare times, though, it can be a monstrous mix of exhilaration and fear. I had one such day a few years ago while working as part of a security team for a prominent Mexican politician. I knew when I took the gig the odds were high I would be shot. Or shot at least. The client's position in society and political stance almost guaranteed some form of cartel contact. I didn't have long to wait for it to happen. Within a month, 2 separate teams made attempts on my client. The first struck me as more of a test of our team's weak points. The second, though, was a full-on attack. I'd always heard many of the cartel soldiers were former Mexican spec op guys. and the way the attack was undertaken seems to prove it. Too bad for them, they weren't American military. They may have succeeded in their work and lived to fight another day. It was less than 2 weeks after the first attack. I was in the last SUV holding the client. We usually ran 2 or more Yukons spread out, much like the way we did our convoys in Iraq. We were in the process of driving him to his office where the gunfire began. The Yukons were obviously armored, and because they were unsure of which SUV held our client, they fired on all of them at the same time. I wasn't particularly concerned at the moment. Protocol was to continue moving until we reached our destination. We were doing just that when the SUV in front of the one I was in was struck with some sort of explosive, probably a rocket-propelled grenade, and flipped onto its side. Our driver swerved quickly around the SUV and kept going. We had prepared for this possibility, but I wasn't scared any less when it happened. If the shooters thought that was going to stop us, they were very wrong. They had the Iraq insurgents to blame. We learned real quick not to stop, regardless of the circumstances. The guys in that Yukon were likely dead anyway. If they weren't, it was better for us to continue and draw fire away from them. We were down to 2 vehicles now. If these guys were smart, they'd have a roadblock somewhere ahead. I was losing it a little bit. I didn't savor the idea of being blown up by an RPG. A black full-size truck was behind us and closing fast. When they got close enough for me to make out individual people, I was overjoyed not to see a guy holding an RPG in his shoulder. The shooting resumed. At this point, the office was less than a mile away. Their roadblock had to be coming up soon, but as the office building came into sight, no roadblock appeared. Odds are, they were counting on us stopping when they blew up our middle Yukon. I was pleased to be underestimated for once in my life. There were armed security officers inside the building. The guy driving the lead SUV had called ahead to warn them. As we pulled into the parking lot, they were already trading shots with the truck chasing us. The driver of my Yukon and I stayed behind while the other 2 guards escorted the client into the building. This was the first time I was able to see our assailants clearly. 1 guy was already dead. The remaining 4 kept up a withering rate of fire. Between the 4 guys in the lead Yukon, the 2 of us and the security force guys, they were vastly outnumbered. It wasn't long before we managed to neutralize the threat. Other than a leg wound on one of the security guys, we emerged unscathed. Since we were confident our client was safe, we took a handful of the security guards with us and went back to check on our guys in the middle Yukon. My suspicions were proved correct. All 4 of them were dead. I guess we didn't come away unscathed after all, and far from it. Although I tried to put up a strong facade, the loss hit closer to home than usual. One of the guys had served with me in Iraq, and we'd gotten very close. When something like this happens, you realize even in situations in which you are surrounded by the death of a friend can still hurt you so much. Clinging into my late 20s, I loved fighting more than anything. The bigger the better, I always said. I was an average weight and height, but dudes still treated me like some little punk. More often than not, I showed them the foolishness of their prejudice. I'll be honest, I took a beating once in a while, but more often than most, I came out on top. It wasn't long before my skill with my fists started catching folks' attention. I was asked to work the door at 17 and kept that job for 5 years while I went to college. A Bachelor of Arts didn't allow me many job opportunities, so after school, I took a job as a bodyguard for a homeboy of mine. He was an up-and-coming rapper with a lot of haters. Many of these punks underestimated me because of my size, since I was much smaller than the rest of the guys he had watching his back. I was the one guy they would try to take out, so that they could get to my homeboy. Onlooker said I was crazy because I was laughing as I beat up individuals that just minutes before were talking a ton of trash. Now things continued this way until my 27th year, when I came to blows with the biggest, toughest dude I'd ever come across in my life. My boy and his set, me included, had just come back from a tour of the Northeast clubs. Things were about to blow up for him. At least 4 big record labels had hinted they wanted to sign him. I guess this made my friend get arrogant, and he had said 1 or 2 things that would draw a bunch of heat his way. The last 3 cities on the tour kept me busy laying punks out. One of the other bodyguards was shot at, the last night. We knew it was just a matter of time until something big was going to go down, and it did after we got back home. We decided it would be a good way to blow off some steam by going to a local club in our hood where everyone knew us. This place seemed to be the safest place for us to have a little fun. Our usual booth was set up for us, and a bottle of champagne was brought over. The next hour went off fine. Then, the biggest dude I'd ever seen walked up to us with another guy. I didn't notice the other dude at first. I was shocked by the size of this man. He shocked me out of my stupor as soon as he began talking trash to the other bodyguard beside me. He tried to defuse the problem. I generally let him try to cool off whoever was approaching us. If he couldn't, I was the first one to start throwing hands. The minute he pushed the other bodyguard aside like a feather, I knew it was on. Trying to move him was like pushing a skyscraper. I decided to scrap the niceties and punch him as hard as possible in the kidneys. Not once, but twice. And this is when I first knew I was in trouble. Up to this point, he'd been focusing on my boy and not me, but the second I punched him, he removed the gloves. If I'd actually hurt him, I couldn't tell. He rocked my world with 2 quick punches and I was out. When I woke up, I was being wheeled away by 2 paramedics. I felt like I'd been hit by a convoy of trucks and could only see through my left eye. The end result was me with 2 broken ribs, a severe concussion, and a right eye that was barely staying in its socket. Once I was able to form coherent thought, I asked my visitors, my boy and the other 2 bodyguards, what happened to me. They said on his 3rd swing, I folded like a book, but he kept kicking me until Rob, the other bodyguard standing there, put him down with a stun gun in the back. Luckily for us all, the cop showed up before he put himself back together. They put 2 pairs of cuffs on him just to be safe. They must have been as impressed by his size as we were. It was the first and only time I'd ever been knocked out. I knew once that had happened, my days of fighting were over. Everyone knows once you lose your chin, you can never get it. It took a while before I was back to normal, and it wasn't until a year later before I could sneeze without fear of my eye popping out. You can probably guess I never went back to bodyguarding. I can also proudly say that that was my last fight. I haven't had more than a calm discussion with another man in 10 years since. When I look back at the man I was back then, I can't help but cringe. I'm disappointed it took me almost being beat to death and having to live the rest of my life with a jacked up eye to wake me up, but it did.
As scary as this video is, there's one thing that terrifies us all: having our identity stolen and losing our passwords. In today's world, everything requires a password. Even worse, each one of these has their own set of very specific requirements. One special character, one number, one capital letter. It's really a mess. I definitely feel this when accessing every form of little social media app login related to running the YouTube channel and podcast. How awesome would it be if you could throw all of these into just one app? That's where Dashlane comes in. Dashlane is a multi-platform and multi-function secure password and digital identity manager that takes the stress out of your everyday login struggle. Gone are the days of remembering an endless list of login credentials, credit card info, and clicking that dreaded forgot password button to reset yours for the 50th time, as this one service can remember them all for you. All it takes is one master password to access your virtual and secure vault that you can add not only logins, but also secured notes, online checkout information, personal ID cards, and contacts. Even better, with Dashlane Premium, you get access to their VPN, dark web monitoring, secure password generation, and complete seamless info synchronization across all of your devices. If password security is important to you online, I highly recommend trying them out. I've been using it for about a month or so now, and it's by far the best password manager that I've used to date. Check out the link in the description, www.dashlane.com/read. That's www.dashlane.com/READ to try it out for free on your first device for life.
I was just told by my dad a story of his young life before he met my mom. It would seem he's never told anyone about this part of his life until today. When he was really young, about 22, he'd formed a gambling addiction. He'd started betting on games every once in a while his first year of college. However, it wasn't long before he was dropping big money. The only people that would handle such big amounts were the mobbed-up guys. They didn't mind if you owed them money because of something called the VIG, usually known as interest. By his senior year, my dad owed over $10,000 to these bookies. This is because by this time he had taken to gambling on card games. Naturally, since these games were illegal in his town, the mob guys were usually the ones who hosted the games. Up to then, he had been able to pay back what he owed, but then he'd just turn around and bet again. He often won, but lost more often. During this whole time, his parents had not known anything about his gambling. He would often get loans for small amounts from them, but always had a satisfying answer for why he needed them. Considering he was a starving college student, they had no problems with giving him the money. As his graduation grew closer, my dad lost big on a card game and accrued another $5,000 on his debt. Even though the bookies had been patient about being repaid in the past, $15,000 was too much to let slide. He had been pressured several times to pay at least part of the debt, but now he was dead broke and couldn't pay a dime. Since he felt the amount was far too high for him to borrow from his parents, he took to hiding out from the bookies. His addictions made hiding out almost impossible. Soon he was found while trying to make a bet with another bookie. Although he thought he could stall the bookie as he had so many times before, he was fed up with my dad's bull and took him for a ride. He found himself in a deserted farmhouse outside town. He was convinced this was the end for him. No one spoke to him until the bookie himself showed up. That was when the scary part started. One of the bookie's bodyguards tied him to a chair and began punching him repeatedly. At first, just in the body. It still hurt, but nothing was compared to when the bodyguard put on a set of brass knuckles and punched him across the face. He said the pain was so bad he fainted. Despite it only being a few strikes, he could tell a few teeth were loose. When he woke up, the bookie stepped forward and told him he's had enough chances. He felt my father had taken advantage of his kindness, and the kindness was over. When he finished, another bodyguard entered the room with a revolver in his hand. My dad said he saw the gun. He knew he was about to die. The bodyguard shoved the barrel of the pistol into his mouth. When Dad told this part, I could see tears beginning to form in his eyes. All these years later, it was like he was still there. Then the bodyguard pulled back the hammer of the gun and pulled the trigger. Dad said he heard a click. Even though the gun had not gone off, he realized that he had peed his pants. He feared this had been a mistake and the guy was about to pull the trigger again, but he let out a sinister laugh, took the gun from Dad's mouth, and walked out of the room. He thought this was some type of psychological torture tactic they did before killing someone, a way for them to get off. However, a moment later, the first bodyguard entered the room and untied him from the chair. Dad said he was still unsure of what was happening until the bookie walked back into the room and told him he was going to give him one more week to come up with the money. If he did not, he would be forced to write it off. If he was going to be forced to do that, Dad would have to repay him with his life. The routine he had just suffered would happen again, but the next time, the gun would go bang when the trigger was pulled. As soon as they dropped him off, Dad knew the clock had started. But where would he get the money? He could barely put one foot in front of the other. His body was killing him, from head to toe. He was sure he had a concussion and at least a few severely bruised ribs. 2 days was the most he could take to heal. It wasn't nearly enough, but he had to come up with 15 grand somehow, and soon. He pulled together almost 1,000 by pawning everything he owned. It was nowhere close to enough, By chance, his parents had given him a brand new car for a graduation gift. He could sell it and just make what he needed, but now, how would he explain it to his parents? Not to mention, how would he get around? His old car was sold for scrap. He knew he had no choice but to let it go, but selling it would mean his parents discovering his problem. The next few days were spent turning things over in his mind. His next to last day, he made the choice that would change his life forever. That morning he left the car lot with just enough. He knew that there was no turning back now. The way was only forward. The bookie was pleased to take the money, but then did something no bookie has done in history. He made it clear that regardless of who it was with, if he ever heard of Dad gambling again, it would mean a ride to the farmhouse. What that bookie didn't realize that morning as my dad walked away was that he'd made Dad's decision all the easier. Dad had come to the conclusion that prior to that night, he was going to ask his parents for help, and that's just what he did. They certainly weren't happy when they first heard about the car, but understood why he had done that. The day after graduation, Dad went into a 90-day rehab program. A few relapses occurred in the following year, but he hasn't even as much as bought a lottery ticket in the last 21 years. Now that I know his story, it makes sense why he would get crabby every year around the time of the Super Bowl, and why he forbade my brother and I from ever buying playing cards. Why would he tell me this story now, after all these years, you might ask? It seems I may be following in his footsteps. He found $100 worth of scratch-offs in my trash can after I had asked him for a loan. My guess is he wanted me to see where that path could lead to. No matter the reason, I've definitely got the hint. I've only recently uncovered a serious problem taking place in the world of entertainment. In the past few years, there have been a rash of assaults by bodyguards upon women involved in doing business with certain personalities in the music and film world. I am well aware of the old days when groupies would trade their services with roadies and other backstage crew in order to get access to the band itself, but this is something far different and more sinister. Multiple times this year, I've been contacted by women hoping to hire myself to compile evidence against their staff, and more specifically, bodyguards of several celebrities. These men have, under false circumstances, led women hoping to gain audiences for legitimate business purposes with these celebrities to private places and taken advantage of them. To add insult to injury, they often have these women ejected from said places under the premise of them being women of the night, looking for a customer, so to speak. After the third victim contacted me, I agreed to take the case on the terms we would combine the complaints together. I believe if the authorities recognize this as a widespread problem, they and the media will take it far more seriously. Fortunately, they all agreed and I began my work to gather the facts of every case. My hopes at the time, and still are, more victims will come forward. Even if it may sound ghoulish, more victims mean more evidence. Each case not being connected to another is very uncommon. Therefore, every time an attack is committed by the same man, the other women's claims are easier for the general public to believe. In order to give the readers a better idea of just how terrible and widespread this problem has become, I'm including a brief synopsis describing the awful experiences a few claimants suffered at the hands of these men. Keep in mind, no names will be used in this report. Despite coming forward, the victims deserve their anonymity until the time comes for any charges to be filed, if they are filed. Also, be clear that although this paper only includes the claims of 2 women, I at present represent over 20 victims. Claimant number 1. In the summer of 1998, I was a representative of a small East Coast record label which was only 2 years old at that point. We were hoping to build our name up on up-and-coming rap artists. After having several back-and-forth talks with one particular artist and his management, I was invited to join them at their suite in New York City. On a Monday afternoon, I visited the suite. I stopped by a bodyguard I assumed to be employed by the artist in a small room outside of the main suite. The bodyguard informed me he would notify his employer and return to let me know if he was available to talk. He returned a few minutes later and told me to wait in a small breakfast area at the end of the hall. He said his boss would join me briefly. It did seem to be a strange request at the time, but I was new to my job and unsure of the usual areas in which artists did business at this particular hotel. I did as I asked and sat at the table in the room and waited. 10 or so minutes later, I was joined in the room by the bodyguard, but without the artist. I was confused about what was occurring until he began speaking to me using crude and suggestive language. Despite my assurances that I wasn't interested in what he wanted, he cornered me into a tiny washroom of some type. This was the point at which he forced himself on me. A brief moment later, when he was done, he told me his boss was not interested in doing business with a company that would send some hoe to his hotel room to trap him into signing a contract. He also told me that if I told anyone about what had happened, I would not be believed. It would be my word against his, and if he had to, he'd cap me. This was when he showed me a large, shiny gun hidden under his coat. Of course, I was terrified and said nothing. When my boss asked me how the meeting turned out, I simply told him that the artist had changed his mind. All of these years, there still isn't a day when I don't flash back to that terrible day and become sickened. Although I'm still very afraid of what that man may do to me, the bravery of all these women has given me the strength to face him and hold him accountable for his actions. Claimant number 2. By 2015, I had been a successful costume designer for many of the most successful pop artists for the good part of 7 years. The night of my assault, I was doing last-minute repairs to a costume. The defendant made one of his well-known comments in passing about my backside. This was far from the first time he had made remarks about my body. Ever since I began doing work for that specific artist, this bodyguard has done his best to get me to hook up with him. Although he did say he wanted to go on a date with me, his actions and words made me believe otherwise. As per usual, I told him I was never going to go anywhere with him. When the show began, I went to the dressing area to clean up. I was not aware that I was alone in the room, but it appears he did. While I worked, at some point I heard the door lock behind me. When I turned to see what happened, I saw the bodyguard standing against the door, smiling. I guess he had followed me into the room. Now that he had me to himself, he forced me to the floor. Despite me doing my best to fight him off, I was no match for his 300-plus pound frame. After it was over, he left the room. I stayed in the room and cried until the show ended and one of the female dancers came into the room. She saw that I was upset and asked me what was wrong. When I told her, she warned me not to say anything to anyone else because I would be blacklisted from working with that artist ever again. She told me a story of how that bodyguard had assaulted another girl, this time another dancer. When she told the artist what had happened to her, instead of being helped, she was fired for being a lying troublemaker. It turns out that man was family of the singer and he believed the bodyguard to be an angel. That artist was my only source of income at the time, so I kept my mouth shut. It turned out to not do me any good. It appears the bodyguard spread around the story that I was more of a groupie than a costume designer. Over time, this story spread through the entertainment community and I ended up unable to find work. It's time for the public to hear the truth of how these things are being handled in the business. I demand my day in court. Now that the readers have a very good idea of my client's claims, I want to encourage any other victims of this type of assault to contact me. If you chose to hire me, I will begin to work on your case right away. Despite what some reading this may think, I'm not publishing this to gain fame or notoriety or money. My only aim is to make the public aware of this terrifying epidemic and to assist my clients in any way possible, to find the justice they so richly deserve. Thank you for your time. Although I have lived a normal big city type of life and experienced my share of violence, I had done my best to avoid the dangers inherent in the world of hip-hop. Especially the way things are these days, it seems every middle-class kid in America is doing their best to show how gangsta they are. Unfortunately, rather than doing this through their rhymes, it's done with guns. A trait once only expressed by the hardest of inner-city rappers has now spread as far as those surrounding them, namely those tasked with the job of protecting the artist from violence, their bodyguards. I don't know from experience or anything, but I would assume these guys would be required to have some sort of training with firearms and other important qualifications. From what I saw the other night, however, they'll let any fool from off the corner do security for rap artists these days. Much to my dismay, last week I was roped into escorting my brother to an album releasing party, a hip-hop one. Even though he's 22 years old, my mom insisted I be there to watch his back in case everything broke into chaos. Sometimes I believe that women are psychic, because chaos certainly did break loose that night. I'll get to that, but first I should say that I know nothing about modern music. The last album I bought was Fallen by Evanescence. I'd never been a rap fan, and going to this party is my idea of torture. But I love my brother, and I would take a bullet for him if required. Therefore, at about 8 that night, we drove to the club it was being held in. I'll admit, I got a good laugh at my brother's expense. He was beyond excited. I hadn't seen him this pumped since we saw the first Iron Man movie. We grabbed a drink and stood around until the festivities began. Finally, after an hour wait, the artists managed to show up and the party started. I'll try to be nice, in case anyone reading this figures out who I'm talking about. When I said this was my idea of torture, I was shooting a little high. What came out of those speakers defies reason. I asked my brother what kind of music we were hearing. He kindly informed me it was something called mumble rap. My God, I thought I'd heard it all. Despite my revulsion, I held my tongue. I didn't want to ruin it for my brother. Someone else would do it for me. The album was about 30 minutes in when I noticed a small scuffle in the area around the artists. The small scuffle quickly grew into a very loud and active argument. The track that was currently playing was completely drowned out. I would have been thankful if it wasn't for what happened next. One side of the argument, I'm not sure which, fired a shot. That's when the release party completely went to chaos. Bullets went flying. No matter the target, I specifically remember seeing the rapper's bodyguards. 3 of them, not counting his entourage, shooting wildly into the air. They weren't the only ones shooting, though. Even the DJ got into the mix. I saw him popping shots off at one of the guys who I believe started the whole frenzy in the first place. People were running right and left, attempting to get away. Unluckily for a few, they got hit. The second it all went off, I searched frantically for my brother. I found him pretty quick, and grabbing him by the arm, we dodged to and fro until we finally made it out. When all was said and done, one bodyguard was injured, but not badly, and 3 members of the crowd had at least 1 shot each. Miraculously, none of them were seriously hurt either. My brother and I were freaked out beyond belief, but kept the night's hijinks from our mom. She did eventually find out a few days later anyway, of course, after it popped up on the news. I just told her the news was blowing the whole thing out of proportion, and she let it go. From what I can tell, this shook my brother up a lot. He's been far quieter than usual, and the thumping bass coming from his room has currently stopped. My theory is that since he's seen rap-related violence firsthand, the whole lifestyle seems much less cool to him than it once did. I did confront him the next morning and asked if he was doing okay. He claimed he was, but I plan to keep an eye out on him until he goes back to being my regular, everyday, annoying little brother. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And you're tearing me apart, Lisa.